Good morning. Dear Sasha, after reading your last letter, Marge had suggested a quotation that we both think is appropriate. It is an often quoted section from the writings of Thomas Jefferson. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Right-wing zealots often use it. It's a great subject to debate. As a young idealist, I had hoped that in my lifetime we would outgrow that thought. Why must it be so? When you told the story about the madness that was created by the rumor of the Jews seeking Christians' blood for Passover, I thought about my childhood. I mentioned to Marge that I know things have changed for the better since the Christian kids threw rocks at our window at Easter time because we were supposed to have something to do with the killing of Jesus. I could never understand that either, because in our child Bible readings we were taught that Jesus chose to die on the cross. However, every time I think that we have reached some sort of maturity, I turn on the television set, and there is one charlatan or another bilking poor people out of their savings with the same old message. Give me your money and do as I say, and I will get you into heaven. Before the turn of the century, young students from St. Petersburg and other narodniki had to travel, mostly by foot, to tell the peasants about the abuses of the father, Tsar Alexander, and his court. The peasants had no radios, newspapers, or television sets. Letters took weeks to get from one town to the other. The police often arrested the narodniki because they themselves had lost communications with St. Petersburg and had no way of knowing that the Tsar's guards were rounding them up. Sasha, I am certain that as a young student you studied all about that. I wonder if the same thing that impressed me impressed you. When I read my Russian history books years ago, the pages became alive at that stage because I realized that it all happened just one generation ago, during my own father's youth. It made me sort of awestruck to feel the importance that the advance in the methods of communication has played in shaping the world. We Americans often boast about our free press. The press is legally free to say what it pleases within the boundaries of libel laws and decency. However, we have a privately owned press without state competition. The irony today is that while the press still sells the idea of its owners, economics have forced American media to become more like American white bread, colorless, tasteless, and without the nourishment of real commitment to anything. It is thought-bound by its advertisers. Few major media outlets will offend the businessmen of the Jewish community with a negative view of anything that Israel does, nor will most of them take a firm stand on any sensitive issue. Newspapers that are politically honest and committed are few in number. One would have to search the country to find any at all. Today, the newspaper business is part and parcel of huge news conglomerates which have bottom-line numbers as their main motivation. Holding companies that own television stations, radio stations, magazines, and newspapers are all feeding the minds of Americans throughout the country with their own message. They hire publishers and editors who are of the same philosophical bent, creating a blanket of mind-numbing, insidious propaganda over the entire population. Their attempt to please all and offend no one pleases the advertisers, but is a drug like Valium to the public. In the late 1800s, the peasants living in the mirs, the self-run villages of Russia, had very little knowledge of what was happening in the palace at St. Petersburg. As you pointed out, with a push of a button, a communication satellite will send them a picture of the President of the United States shaking hands with Secretary Gorbachev thousands of miles away within minutes of the event. That makes this not only a different world, but places the ability to gain world control in the hands of a few without military intervention. The biggest weapon used in revolutionary battles today is the media. The amount of money a political candidate spends for television commercials and how that person may appear on television determines the future of the country and perhaps the world. Conversely, not being able to penetrate the press with their ideas is the main reason for terrorist activities. Frustrated people with a fervent political message will resort to any means to get that attention. I believe that the media is mainly responsible for the terrorism emanating from the Middle East because of their unbalanced reporting. Were both sides of an issue allowed to present their case, we would not see Palestinian children being shot down by Israeli soldiers for throwing rocks. I can remember hearing Golda Meir say, "There was never a Palestine, so how can there be any Palestinians?" The stomach-turning brutality on the West Bank by the Israelis is a direct result of the American media accepting that line of thought. It left Americans wondering, who are the terrorists? Who are getting shot on the West Bank? When one reads of a Palestinian stabbing an Israeli citizen, he is always described as a crazed terrorist. The majority of Americans have no idea who or what a Palestinian is. To them, the Israelis are killing non-persons, just as we killed Gooks in Korea, and you killed Hitlerites that were not German people, and the Nazis killed the Untermensch. Recently, a particularly obnoxious talk show host was asked why he never had a guest on his program with a different opinion. His answer was, let him get his own program. The trouble is, liberals cannot get their own program because the majority of broadcast station owners are also conservative, and with bottom-line interests only. They, in turn, hire conservative station managers, directors, talk show hosts, etc. Sasha, as you know, I am not a pacifist. But I take no sides with the killers in the Middle East, be they Arab fanatics or Israeli fanatics. There is a solution. A Palestinian homeland is needed for disenfranchised, oppressed, suffering, displaced Palestinians, just as a homeland was needed for the suffering, displaced Jews. My anger and disappointment is not directed at the Israelis. They are floundering in a sea of emotion, and their young people cannot penetrate the fog of propaganda that they have been raised on. It is the self-deception of the diaspora that angers me, the above-average income American Jews who revel in the fact that they are now part of the winning team. They have hypnotized themselves into adopting the idiotic rationale of the radical Jewish right, which is, we Jews have suffered so much injustice for so long, let someone else have the injustice for a while. I know that this is not a very nice way to start a letter, but I have just read about the killing of more children on the West Bank. As a Jew, I feel insulted. I know that my mother and her family would feel the same. What hurts me most is that I failed so badly in my attempt to bring some light to the darkness that the Western media has kept the public in. When I say the public, I include American Jews. You would be appalled, as I was, to learn how little many of them know or want to know about the history of the Middle East and about the people who lived there over the centuries. They are blinded by the versions of the religionists and kept in the dark by the media. When I brought Avneri to America, I thought that perhaps it would be the beginning of a movement that we called the teach-in era of the 60s. Allowing our ego to get the best of us, many who were opposed to the war in Vietnam thought that all we had to do was present the facts and the correct history to the students, and the media would be forced to pick up our message. We were wrong, and I made the same mistake again. I saw the tour of this articulate, courageous member of the Israeli parliament as a very positive approach for those who wanted to see Israel survive and her young people to grow up to serve an outpost of culture against barbarism, as Herschel stated in Der Judensatz. That failure was particularly embarrassing to me because of my experience in the field of communications. I truly thought that I could do much better, but the wall that the major media placed in front of us was insurmountable. Well, perhaps we can talk more about that subject later. Marge says that I should try to control my emotion and respond to your very informative letter about lifestyle. I thought that I had already written such a letter. Perhaps Marge and Nadine are on the same brain frequency. We live in a 3-bedroom ranch-style house in a very quiet neighborhood. It's ideal for me. It is the perfect peaceful atmosphere for a writer. There's very little traffic. When an automobile does go by, I often look up to see if I know the driver. The United States government did not give me the money to buy this house, but it did guarantee the bank loan, which made it very easy for me to purchase it. As a veteran of World War II, I was given a very low interest rate. It is much more difficult for my children to buy a home today. They must have a much higher income than I had back in 1953. They usually have to combine the income of both husband and wife. That can be very risky business. Since the beginning of the Cold War, military contracts have boosted the economy to the point of skyrocketing real estate prices. But in sections where you have economic crisis, like in Texas, the prices for housing has plummeted. In areas where the prices drop, there are few buyers because there are few jobs. In my area, one income does not sustain a home in the majority of cases. I used to think that $20,000 was a lot of money. Today, two hardworking people find that if they save $20,000, it's still not enough to make a down payment on a home. Most average houses here are selling for over $150,000 and more. In 1952, I paid $15,000 for my home. Today it would sell for $165,000. I have added one room and a garage, but that will give you some kind of an idea of the increase in land and home values. As an economist, I am sure that you know that land values in the capitalist system are like the commodities market. They can change drastically in a very short time, taking the economy with them in one direction or another. I was very moved by your painful story regarding your son, Gregoria. Marge and I were both pleased that the story had a happy ending. We also had a similar experience, and we know the pain that you had to endure. I mentioned it once before, and I will not go into much detail because I have no desire to relive that pain. The new American lifestyle, adopted in the 60s and still prevalent, is not conducive to the raising of children. At this writing, there is a presidential campaign going on, and the two major issues are crime and drugs. That should tell you more than I can about the society that our young people now function in. We have been very unfair to them, and now we leave them with the biggest debt in our history, a debt that they will be forced to pay by making great sacrifices. They cannot expect to have the easy lifestyle that they were promised in the 50s. I must add here, Sasha, that our story about my son also has a happy ending. He became a hard-working, well-respected, loving father and a productive citizen. My children were subjected to the drug society everywhere they went. It seemed that there was no escape. Drugs were sold in the schools, on the playgrounds, and in the ski resorts where they spent much of their time in the winter months. They are grown now and trying to cope and lead normal lives. They are involved in broadcasting, the food industry, well drilling, and merchandising. But for so many other Americans, there was no happy ending. The kind of tragedy that befell the famous Kennedy family when one of their young and talented family members died of a drug overdose was happening to families almost every day, and still is. Drug abuse is a scourge that infected the entire nation. It affects black, white, rich, poor. We seem not to be able to stamp it out. Perhaps that is because no one has had the courage to address the profit motive of the powerful cartels or the psychological reasons that cause so many of our young people to seek escape from reality. Marge would like Nadine to know that she leaves here at 8 in the morning for her office and does not return until 6 at night. So I have to do all the cooking and cleaning because I'm here. We are personally beyond the problems of the nation now, and we have a very good life. What I have the most difficulty with is handling the guilt. We should have done better. We should have done more. Marge and I would never think of leaving our country. As I said, things are pretty easy for us now, but we both feel the obligation to try and make things better for the young people. Their America is a very difficult place for them to find their own decalogue that will guide them. With the enormous natural resources, 2 oceans, 4 growing seasons, and the talents of workers from all over the world, the question is, did we do the best we could for the next generation with the Constitution that we had to work with? My answer is no. Instead, we are moving farther to the right and certain disaster. When I returned from my first trip to Israel, the progressive movement in the U.S. was at a standstill. Black militants were left by liberal Americans to swing in the breeze. Without white support or even black support, the FBI soon destroyed them. Americans were reacting to racism, but they had no political ideology or even projections that were laid on steel rails. The famous dream speech of Martin Luther King, delivered in Washington, D.C. in August of 1963, was simply an articulation of what blacks had dreamed about for centuries. But like most preachers and religionists, Dr. King painted a picture of heaven. It was a great speech for what it was designed to do, and that was to galvanize America, black and white Americans, into moving more quickly into the sunshine of equality. Like most preachers, Dr. King's naivete kept him from getting involved in political theorem. Marches and protests only took you to one level. There, the elevator to justice stopped. Black leaders, including Dr. King, finally gave in to the demands of young radicals and brought the civil rights and anti-war movements together. Sand had been put on the tracks, and the slipping wheels began to move. In a speech before almost 400,000 people in New York City, Dr. King changed his image from black preacher and civil rights leader into an influential political figure with both black and white following. Racists in America found that to be intolerable, and King was assassinated. The Love Movement that began in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1963 and blossomed in Selma, Alabama in March of 1965 began to disintegrate in Mississippi in June of 1966. It continued to fall apart during the riots of 68 and 69. By 1970, the movement was dead, and so was Dr. King. The death of the leader, who served as a mortise for the fragments, left a void that could not be filled. I tried to portray the feeling of defeat that so many blacks felt at the time in my work, The Second Civil War. The momentum was gone, and the riots that frightened America to a point of reaction served only to destroy black communities. White America had good reason to be frightened. At the height of the uprisings, or mini-wars that were going on between enraged blacks and the state militia, the local police, the fires reached close to the White House. The president ordered the United States Marines to protect the president's residence. Many city blocks in the nation's capital were on fire. That all followed King's death and hastened white flight from the cities to the suburbs and widened the gap even further between black and white America. Nothing has worked to narrow that gap since. Many token and highly visible black achievements have been used to create an illusion of change, but the bottom line is that the economic gap continues to widen. And after all, that is what matters most. President Johnson's war on poverty failed because by the time it was put into effect, white flight out of the cities was almost at a panic stage and could not be stopped. Whites did not want to look back. They built highways around the cities so they would not even have to look at them as they drove to and from work. With the constant loss of a tax base, the cities soon began to crumble, and black politicians that took it over found themselves at the mercy of the drug lords. The cost of trying to control crime is enormous. The Black Revolution now takes another form. It is a three-headed monster that doesn't know who to bite first. One uses suicidal methods to draw attention to the plight of blacks. Another tries to reorganize a 1960s type of resistance. And the third simply says that if you can't beat them, join them. They are the figureheads of the pacification program. The tragedy is that none of these methods have the ingredients for success. America was moving rapidly to the right and taking all of its satellites, including Israel, with it. Racism was given a new life. Uri Avneri arrived in October of 1970, and his tour was, for me, an awakening. A lesson in the art of sophistry. Right-wing Zionists turned black and white, turned into white and white into black. It was, to say, at the least, an emotionally draining experience for me. I am a Jew, and they call me anti-Semitic. I come from a family that fought fascism for generations, and they call me a fascist. Friends became enemies, and enemies tried to be friends. To me, the Middle East was the most important subject in the world, and I was traveling with a member of the Israeli parliament who had a legitimate idea for peace in the region. And the major media made a point to ignore it. It didn't matter if you agreed with Avneri or not. He had the credentials to present his ideas to America. At least I thought it was a way to establish dialogue with a heretofore mute Jewish community. The thing that I found to be the most astounding was the intellectual blind spot in the eyes of so many liberals. They told me that by criticizing anything that Israel does, I was encouraging anti-Semitism. My reply was always the same. After many trips to Israel, I found that the most virulent anti-Semitism that I ever personally witnessed was the kind that was being practiced by Ashkenazi Israelis, Sephardim Jews, those born in the Semitic land and who came from the families that go back many generations there are the niggers of Israel. They who have brown eyes and dark skin are deprived of equal opportunity in their own state. They are also Jews. They live in Israeli ghettos. They were demonstrating for jobs, education, and better housing. What the hell, one talk show host in Waterbury, Connecticut told me. They are the chess beaters. Many of them never went to school. He is a Jew, a devoted Zionist, and one who pretends to be in favor of civil rights. I asked him if he had ever heard, as I did, a young Israeli say, I should call him an Israeli and not a Jew. And if that doesn't make young Savras filled with Zionist nationalism, Jewish, self-haters. No, he replied the host. I have found that in Israel too, but it's simply an expression of pride. Sasha, the blind spot is also magic. It shows pretty pictures anytime one wants to call on it to do so. It was all a very depressing and frustrating experience for me. Like millions of others, being a Jew never had any religious significance for me, and while I personally never had any attachment to Zionism, my mother and her family certainly did. To me, Jewishness was the genius of Einstein, the talent of Herfetz, the compassion of my grandmother and my mother. It was the generosity of the many Jewish merchants who kept us on the books during the Depression. Many of the people who came to our home for meetings during the labor wars were Jews. Many Jews fought to stop fascism before it became the popular cause of World War II. They fought with the Lincoln Brigade in Spain. Many Jews were in the forefront of the battle to end racism in America. I had a very positive Jewish vision. I loved being Jewish. I felt the emotion when my plane first landed at LOD Airport in Israel, and I saw the Israeli flag flying. But with each trip, I began to feel less and less like a Jew, because for a time I could not equate Israel with my Jewish vision. I made the mistake of thinking that Zionism would take my Jewishness away from me, like the young men in Israel who want to be called Israelis and not Jews. It cannot. I am an American. I do not call myself a Jewish American or a Russian American. I am an American. But in Israel, in order to be a first-class citizen, you must be a Jew. Asif Dayan said, I call myself a Jew because otherwise I would have no rationale for taking someone else's land, home, and furniture. I will allow no one to take my Jewishness from me and replace it with ordinary destructive nationalism, Sasha. I understand Jewish paranoia. I lived with it most of my life. I also understand the desire to be on the winning team for once. I understand the need for persecuted Jews to have a sanctuary that they can go to and to be Jewish as they wanted to be. I do not understand the hypocrisy of those zealots who hide their chauvinism behind religion when religion plays such a small part of the lives of most Israelis. I do not understand the need for a pure Jewish state any more than I can understand the need for ethnic cleansing anywhere. Back in 1961, I read a speech by Menachem Begin, then the leader of a small extreme right-wing political party in Israel. As I read the speech, I began to feel more and more apprehensive. I knew that his party was still a minor one, and I had faith in the Jewish people, but I also knew how infectious greed and its companion disease, arrogance, can be. Begin said in his speech before the Knesset, we cannot exist this way. We must be on both sides of the Jordan. We need more water, more oil, more fertile land. I decided to try a different tactic towards making a contribution for a more rational handle that Jews could grasp vis-a-vis Israel. The best way that I thought that I could help was to use my experience as a broadcaster and media person. I decided to make a film that perhaps would be helpful not only to Jews everywhere, but also to children of all races that will have to live with the judgments made by their parents. We opened our film, running credits and dialogue, in front of a backdrop of a historic and preserved tree in downtown Tel Aviv. Legend has it that original Zionists gathered often under that tree to plan their future. We chose young, handsome Asif Dayan, the son of then Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, to be our host. As a young Sabra, born and raised in Israel, one who embodied the future of the land, Asif sat with a group of children under the tree and talked about the dreams and the problems of the early settlers. We had intended to go from there to many Arab and Israeli villages to interview children, always with Asif as our host. At that time, Israeli leaders were telling their young people to keep in mind the Holocaust and not to even think about the future. Young minds were being kept locked in the present. The final great aliyah, or wave of immigrants that were expected from the U.S. and Eastern Europe, still had not materialized. Ashkenazim, Sephardim, Israelis, and Arabs of different sects, and all children that still lived in the area, were to give Asif their recent experiences. Some spoke of going back to villages that no longer existed. All the Arab homes were knocked down, and Israeli villages had replaced them. And how they would plan their future. It was a simple documentary, innocuous enough, we thought, to not have any problems with the strict Israeli censor. There was an old saying in Israel that claimed, whenever an old Israeli politician dies, there is always another old politician to take his place. No one seemed to listen to young people. Old fears and old prejudices dictated their future. Old, outdated nationalism had found itself stuck in the drying swamp, much like it has in England. Many of the young were leaving and going to New York to drive taxicabs. Our mission was to show that the dreams of young Arabs and Jews were very much alike. They could live in peace and make a federation of states work, and the outpost of culture against barbarism a reality. I am sorry to say that we let the opportunity slip through our fingers. Since then, Israeli jails bulging with political prisoners have created hatred that is now manifesting itself in the form of the desperate rebellion taking place on the West Bank. It is a hatred that will take generations to erase. Palestinians will not forget their own Holocaust. I will not waste time by going into detail regarding the destruction of our project. We shot some beautiful film, but dogmatic fanatics who dumped human waste on our sets and harassed not only us, but also others who invested in the project, causing them to cancel out. They sabotaged us from the beginning. The zealots branded me with their most vicious weapon. I was called a divisive Jew. That was the worst label the right-wing extremist Zionists could pin on a liberal Jew. I was in shock. Zionism has done one thing that I never thought could be done. It has demanded and received blind faith support from Jews. I gave up. I scrapped the project and went home. I felt like a boxed wildcat. A stew of emotions was boiling inside of me. Anger was beginning to take control of my thoughts. Here at home, we were in the middle of another deep recession, which the governor of my own state called a depression. Two enemies had found each other and married. Unemployment and inflation had merged. Once again, I sought asylum in my typewriter, and I wrote a novel about the failure of the ecumenical movement called Ecumenical Death. When I was with the American Friends Service Committee, I worked closely with religious leaders. At that time, there were many issues that bound us together, but Pope John's ecumenical movement was doomed from the start. One day I received my electric bill from one of the privately owned monopolies, the electric holding company that services our section of the country. I can see the smile on your face, Sasha. To a Soviet economist, the phrase privately owned monopoly must have a comical ring to it, but it's not a joke here. The appalling increase in 1974 was just the beginning of a lethal injection into the recession-inflated, plagued economy that would keep growth down and become a heavy boot on the head of an already writhing populace. I tried to convince the people of my state that even if we have a slight strengthening of the economy, the out-of-control utility companies would eventually deliver a fatal blow. The weight of runaway utility costs, fanned by easy-to-buy politicians, landed on the backs of retired and working people like a huge monkey that continues to grow and cannot be removed. I formed the Committee for Lower Utility Bills. I saw the ever-growing and oppressive utility costs as not only the fountainhead of worker exploitation, but also a devastating blow to small business, and therefore another very serious negative factor in our failing economy. The cascading mergers of company after company into huge monopolies seemed to pose a very serious threat to the entire nation. Feeling that we were on the downside of the same cycle that President Roosevelt said was a major factor in causing the Great Depression of the 30s, and remembering the misery that it caused my family, I felt I had to act. Franklin Roosevelt saw the same threat even before he became president in March of 1933. He began his battle against the utility holding companies when he was still governor of New York in 1935. As president, he initiated the 1935 Holding Company Act to prevent that same disaster from happening again. But easy-to-buy politicians went to work after FDR's death and restored the holding companies. The October crash of the stock market in 1987 was only the first crack in the dike. The real results of the unregulated and undisciplined stock markets, where mergers are putting all of the The American crash of the stock market in 1987 was only the first crack in the dike. The real results of the unregulated and undisciplined stock market, where mergers are putting all of American dependents on the sale of stock issues instead of the production of saleable goods, is the constant layoffs that we read about daily in our newspapers. We have lost the quality and quantity of saleable product that we could move to international markets. I do not envy the next president of the United States, who will have to make some order out of the economic chaos. The next president will have to hurry, as FDR did, to get some flooring under the economic tissue paper that we are all walking on. Sasha, I enjoyed talking to you so much that I wonder what we will do when we get together. Will we ever sleep? Marge just called from her office to remind me that we are leaving for a short vacation on the coast of Maine. I have been so absent-minded lately that she wanted to be sure that I was getting things ready, so I must close now. As always, we look forward to your next letter. Sincerely and with love, from all of us, David. Thank you.